Now, this African storyteller is a brand, reputation and stakeholder relationship management company. The founder and managing director of the African Storyteller, that's Thuli Piri, joins us now to discuss the crisis communications management and stakeholder relations. That's management. Thuli, many thanks for making time to speak to us.
Thank you.
I love the notion of Africa Rising, but the problem with Africa Rising is Africa does have terrible PR, and we always find ourselves on the wrong side of things. Tell me, people like you in your line of work, tell me, how do you fit into this particular puzzle?
So thank you so much again for having me. I think Africa's stories of success and the potential that the continent has are yet to be told. What we currently have is a narrative that is pretty much driven by people that claim to understand the African continent and are not Africans in the main, and they are actually looking at Africa from a completely different perspective. Hence you have companies like the African Storyteller, which are run by Africans, because I firmly believe that with all the negative stories, with all the myths about Africa, we have a responsibility to actually stand up for the continent and say, yes, we have corruption, yes, we may have infrastructure backlog, yes, we may have all the other challenges, but guess what? There are companies that are doing business in Africa, they are succeeding in Africa, there are political leaders that are in office that are not necessarily corrupt, that have the best interest of Africa, and we have young people that are actually one of the best, most intelligent people in the world. Some of the best inventors are coming from Africa. So it's not all dull and gloom. And the way that PR or public relations work is really based on trying to push a particular narrative. And we are actually saying that is the old way of doing things. We need to come together onto the drawing board with the public sector, the private sector, and have very honest and robust conversations on how we can take Africa forward, on what is working and what is not working, and almost be able to tell an authentic story of the African continent without necessarily trying to put lipstick on a pig.
And I must come in there. Yeah. I think it's very interesting you say that it's the importance is Africans telling the African story.
Precisely.
And you are 100% woman-owned,
yeah.
Black-owned,
yeah.
And surely this comes with some challenges. Apart from pushing out that negative narrative that we get from the West, being 100% black and female owned in a society where that's seen as the exception rather than the norm, how have you been able to navigate that space?
So I always say that the biggest challenge is our own psyche. If you believe within your own self that you're going to meet these challenges, then you definitely will. That's the first thing. But in reality, you do meet those challenges, right? And they are in twofold. One is actually having multinational companies that would preach supporting SMEs in terms of their PR stories, but in reality, when they work in the background, they still want you to be subservient to big PR firms that are coming from the UK, from the US, and so forth. And our positioning is very different. We say we are not a PR company, absolutely not, because we cannot actually promise clients that they will have positive coverage, but we are a relationship making company, which is why we say we connect, we engage and share with our clients and with their stakeholders on what works. For a woman being in this space, I've actually worked across the African continent for quite a long time. You know, I have about 20 years experience working on the continent, and it is actually transforming. I'm finding it to be more receptive of women, you know, in my position. And the biggest challenge, obviously, I think is still cultural dynamics, where you find that in certain, sides of the continent or regions on the continent, it is actually still frowned upon to have a woman basically sitting in a predominantly male-dominated boardroom and advising them on how to best position themselves in this continent. But I think if you actually focus on the value that you're bringing to the table and you back your information with facts, you start to see change, and you start to see almost a receptiveness to this woman being, amongst the men in the boardroom. Africa is still predominantly male in business. It is a men's world. And we need to actually try and create that gender balance.
Right. I think it was Theodore Roosevelt who once said that all horse thieves are Democrats, but not all Democrats are horse thieves. Tell me, do you have to be an African to tell the African story? Or what do you say to some people who argue that agencies like this are actually riding the African card?
Well, I can actually almost tell you now for a fact that if I'm an African and I go to the US and try to tell the US story, I will actually get it so wrong, right? There are so many dynamics to a nation, to a community, to a society. And I would probably misinterpret a lot of stuff, you know. Being an African and telling the African story does not actually earn me any better privilege than any other company. I still have to work hard and fight for the same business, but guess what? Nobody can actually tell me about my culture and how I need to position and actually tell a narrative in a manner that our leaders will start to actually understand and be receptive to. Nobody can actually best articulate the challenges of women or young people in the African continent than a young African woman working and living and born and bred in this continent. And then lastly, I do believe that there is still a role to play for global agencies, if you want to put it that way, because we need to sell Africa to the world. And that is where we can then partner with them to actually take our stories to your European markets, your Chinese markets, and so forth. And if you look at the model that, you know, a lot of agencies are currently using nowadays in the continent, is really partnering with indigenous companies, because they understand that you cannot take away the Africanness in me. I am African and I do understand this continent. It is home after all. And if I knock on the door of a government leader, a government minister, a CEO, and have a robust conversation on Africa and they are African, it is completely different to a conversation where they are actually intimidated by an American, a US, Chinese journalist who is actually coming with a probing or very negative, you know, angle to the story.
Let's quickly talk about crisis management. You have been doing business across sub-Saharan Africa, and I just want to get an understanding of the ways in which we deal with different situations and really how companies are able to rebrand themselves. The Tiger brands, for example, is Steinhoff, SA Inc. With the state capture. What trends are you seeing in terms of how we deal with it, and are companies actually coming out on top after such situations?
So I'll start with what is not working before going to what could work, right? So the trend that we are actually seeing, one is actually getting a very uncoordinated, inconsistent messaging that normally comes out in terms of crisis. Whether you look at South Africa Inc., where 1 minute we support this, then we don't support this, then one minister comes out saying something else, another minister almost contradicts them, same thing with Tiger Brands and so forth. The biggest part that is actually missing, and you can almost tell the minute a CEO or a minister comes on board and actually starts to try and put out the fire, is that one, you can tell that they have no relationship with their stakeholders. In the instance of a Tiger brand, there would absolutely be no reason why a minister of health would say something different to what the CEO says, and then the media says, why, how come the minister is saying, you know, you guys have been told about this and you're saying you have not been told? There's a lot of work that needs to go on in the background when there is no crisis, in bringing your stakeholders on board, getting them to understand where you are going, the direction that you're actually taking, and almost agreeing on what is mutually beneficial for the country, for the company, and in a time of a crisis, you know, how are we going to deal with this crisis? So in most instances, you don't have a crisis management team. That would almost get into a war room and say, let us lock ourselves in this room and let us figure this out together without necessarily pointing fingers. And then I think what would also work is utmost transparency. Old PR doesn't work. You know, when you come and you sit in front of a journalist, you are not addressing the journalist, you are addressing the world. The media space has become global. Everything that is local is instantly transmitted anywhere in the world. And you need to understand that it is okay. It is absolutely okay to find yourself on the wrong side. What is important is how you're going to correct it. Exactly.
Absolutely.